Thomas cast out his son for loving an unworthy girl, unaware that she was the daughter of a billionaire. His pride ruined everything. What happens next will astonish even the most jaded. But let's start from the beginning. Millionaire Thomas Whitfield, dressed in an expensive suit, sat behind his enormous desk in his luxurious office on the top floor of his elite mansion, offering a panoramic view of Los Angeles. The room was filled with symbols of his success: antique books, rare works of art, massive bookshelves, and leather armchairs. Everything here spoke of the influence and power that Thomas had accumulated over decades, transforming a small company into an entire business empire. Standing before him was his only son, Alex. Thomas had always considered him the hope for continuing the family legacy, the man who would one day take over the corporation and solidify the Whitfield dynasty. But what Alex had just said shattered those expectations. "I'm going to marry Emily," Alex declared firmly. These words seemed to hang in the air, filling the room with tension. Thomas looked at his son as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Emily? A waitress? This simple girl didn't meet his high standards, not to mention that she had neither wealth nor social standing. Thomas slowly rose from his desk, his face gradually darkening. For a moment he remained silent, as if struggling to find words after such an unexpected blow. But then the fury overtook him. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted sharply, slamming his fist on the desk. The sound echoed through the office. "This Emily is absolutely not for you. You must marry a worthy woman, someone who will help you run our company, someone who can support you in important matters. A waitress from a cheap cafe can offer you nothing." His voice vibrated with anger, and his gaze burned into his son. Thomas was used to his decisions being right, and everyone obeying his will. He was confident that after these words, Alex would realize his mistake, back down, and return to the correct path his father had chosen for him. But Alex did not back down. His face was stern, his eyes filled with determination. This was one of those rare moments when the son didn't buckle under his father's pressure, didn't yield to the force. He had already made his choice. "I love her, Dad," Alex said, his voice calm but firm. "And no amount of money or argument will change the fact that I want to be with her. My life, my choice. I chose her." These words, spoken calmly but resolutely, only fueled Thomas's anger further. He felt his heart race, and his fury surged again. His face reddened, and his fists clenched. No one, not a single person, especially not his son, could defy his decisions. "If you marry that Emily," Thomas shouted in rage, "you can forget about our family, the company, the inheritance. You will no longer be a Whitfield. I disown you. You'll get nothing more from me. You chose her? Fine. Then forget the life I provided for you." A heavy silence fell over the room. Alex stood still, taking in the weight of those words. He understood that this was not just a threat. His father meant it. Alex felt anxiety and uncertainty rise inside him, but also a sense of freedom from the constraints he had felt since childhood. This was a choice he knew he would have to make sooner or later. Taking a deep breath, Alex raised his eyes to his father. His face remained calm, though conflicting emotions raged inside. "Goodbye, Father," he said evenly. Without waiting for a response, Alex turned and headed for the door. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor, leaving Thomas standing alone. The door slammed shut behind his son with a resounding bang, and Thomas, clenching his teeth, realized in the silence that he had just lost his heir. After the fallout with his father, Alex and Emily moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Their new home was in an old brick building, constructed several decades ago. The stairwell smelled damp, and the walls were marked with the traces of time and the lives of many former tenants. The tiny two-room apartment they moved into was far from the luxury Alex had been accustomed to. But in this modest corner, they began to build their life anew. The apartment consisted of a cramped kitchen, a small bedroom, and a living room that also served as their workspace. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the old linoleum floor creaked with every step. The furniture was far from new, purchased at a clearance sale for a symbolic price. A couch, a table, and a few chairs. This was enough for the two of them. Alex personally renovated the bathroom, gritting his teeth as he learned skills he had never before considered. For the first time in his life, he felt he was creating his own space with his own hands, without the help of his father or money. Financial difficulties quickly became apparent. Unlike his previous life, where Alex never had to think about paying bills or budgeting expenses, now every dollar mattered. They saved on everything, buying discounted groceries, avoiding unnecessary purchases, and carefully planning before allowing themselves even the smallest meal at a cafe. Electricity and water became subjects of strict conservation. Alex and Emily turned off lights in every room when they left, and they tried not to waste water. Alex found a job at a small law firm that specialized in middle-class cases and minor civil disputes. His office was small, without the grand city view like his father's, but Alex took pride in the fact that it was his own, earned through his own efforts. His work now involved drafting contracts, providing client consultations, and handling minor legal cases. It wasn't the grand legal career he had envisioned, but Alex felt satisfaction in doing something real and meaningful, even if modest. Emily continued working as a waitress at the same cafe where they had met. The cafe was on the corner of a busy street, frequented by regular customers, blue-collar workers, students, retirees. Although the work was tiring and repetitive, Emily genuinely enjoyed her role. She knew everyone by name, knew who liked what, and felt part of this small community. Her colleagues respected her for her kindness and openness, and customers often left her tips, appreciating her smile and attention. However, her wages were small, and every penny had to be saved. Despite all the challenges, they were truly happy. Alex began to realize that happiness wasn't in wealth, but in relationships, and the simple joys they could share with Emily. In the evenings, they cooked together, read books, or watched old movies while sitting on their modest couch. Sometimes they simply took walks in the park, holding hands. This was a different kind of life, unfamiliar to Alex, but he was beginning to understand that he was finally free from the constant pressure of expectations and obligations imposed by his father. While Alex was building his new life, Thomas Whitfield remained in his enormous mansion, which now seemed empty and cold to him. The villa was the embodiment of his success. Huge halls, marble floors, paintings by great artists, personal chefs, and staff ready to fulfill his every wish. But this grandeur no longer brought him any pleasure. The house, once a venue for important business meetings, lavish receptions, and family celebrations, had become quiet and gloomy. Thomas couldn't believe that his son, heir to a vast fortune, had chosen such a life. He was certain that Alex would soon return, apologize, and admit his mistake. Thomas waited for that moment, continuing to live his usual life. But the longer the silence from his son stretched, the more his anger grew. Rumors that reached Thomas through his business circles only deepened the wound. Acquaintances told him that Alex lived in a modest apartment, worked as a simple lawyer, and led a life far removed from luxury. Every time Thomas heard this, it filled him with bitterness. He couldn't accept that his son had willingly chosen poverty and simplicity, turning his back on all the privileges he had once had. After several months, Thomas could no longer bear it. Deciding that he had to see for himself how Alex was falling, he got into his black Bentley and drove to the neighborhood where his son now lived. When he arrived, Thomas was shocked. It was a working-class neighborhood, but tidy, with clean streets and well-kept houses. The people living there led normal lives, without luxury, but not in poverty either. When Thomas pulled up to the modest apartment building where Alex and Emily lived, he was certain he would find a broken and regretful son. However, the scene before him was very different. Alex and Emily came out of the house, laughing and talking happily. They looked content, despite their modest lifestyle. Thomas realized that his son not only had no regrets about his choice, but had truly found what he had been searching for. Happiness and harmony, things money couldn't buy. As Thomas Whitfield slowly drove up to the address, painstakingly obtained through his business contacts, he felt his heart start to race. He didn't expect to see anything remarkable. A modest neighborhood, narrow streets lined with small houses, and simple apartments. This world was so far removed from the life Thomas was accustomed to that his gaze instinctively searched for signs of poverty or decline. In his mind, he was still certain that after several months in such conditions, his son would already regret his choice and be ready to return. But when Thomas stopped his car, a sleek black Bentley gleaming against the backdrop of run-down houses and the modest cars of the neighborhood's residents, his attention was immediately drawn to a man standing outside Alex and Emily's home. This man didn't fit into the usual picture of the area. His impeccably tailored, expensive suit looked as if it had just been purchased from a top boutique, and his posture, expression, and very presence clearly indicated high status. Thomas didn't recognize him immediately, but something about the man felt familiar, stirring a sense of unease. The man stood confidently, as though he owned the place. For a moment, Thomas even wondered if he had gotten the address wrong. How could this man be connected to his son? But his doubts quickly dissipated when the door of the house, in front of which the stranger stood, opened, and Emily appeared in the doorway. She was dressed simply, in everyday clothes, the kind worn by many young women her age. But what truly shocked Thomas was her reaction. Upon seeing the man, Emily broke into a wide smile and immediately walked over to him, embracing him warmly. Their gestures and expressions left no doubt. This was a meeting of close, perhaps even family members. Thomas sat in his car, unable to take his eyes off the scene. His heart froze, and questions began to swirl in his mind. How could a waitress, as Alex had described her, be so close to a man clearly belonging to the elite? At that moment, Thomas took a closer look at the man, and suddenly, the realization hit him. His face turned as pale as marble, and his hands, gripping the steering wheel, began to tremble slightly. The man was none other than Mark Blake, one of the most renowned and powerful figures in the country, a billionaire whose name was synonymous with business success. Mark Blake, a man respected and feared in all business circles, was standing here, outside the home where his son now lived. Thomas felt the world spin around him. Why was one of the wealthiest men in the country standing at the door of a house where Alex and Emily lived? How were they connected? The answer began to form in his mind, but Thomas resisted believing what seemed obvious. He forced himself to keep watching, trying to find a rational explanation. The door opened wider, and Emily, smiling, approached Mark, embracing him even more tightly. This was not a simple greeting. It was a display of genuine familial affection. Thomas felt his world start to crumble. This was no coincidence. There was no doubt that Mark Blake was Emily's father. The woman he had scorned for her unworthy status turned out to be the daughter of one of the most influential billionaires in the country. Thoughts began to race through Thomas's mind. How could he have not known? How could he have made such a catastrophic mistake? His son had married the daughter of one of the world's most powerful men, and Thomas had rejected them both out of arrogance and prejudice. Everything he thought he knew about life, everything his beliefs about the importance of money and status were built upon, suddenly seemed false. "How is this possible?" Thomas whispered, barely believing his eyes and struggling to find answers. Emily, the simple waitress he had always thought of her as, was actually the heiress to a vast fortune. Yet she had chosen to live a modest life, far from the luxuries and business empires she could have easily embraced. She could have had everything, lived in the finest house, driven the most expensive cars, attended the most exclusive events, but instead, she chose a life grounded in love, honesty, and simplicity. Thomas felt the weight of this realization shatter his pride completely. He had rejected his son over a woman he deemed unworthy of their family, never realizing that she was not only worthy, but far stronger than he had ever imagined. Emily could have easily leveraged her father's wealth, yet she had chosen a path of hardship and sincerity. She had shown that true values lie not in money or status, but in choosing what truly matters in life. Sitting in his car, Thomas felt a growing sense of bitterness in his chest. He remembered the day he cast Alex out, when he declared that if Alex chose Emily, he would no longer be part of the family. At that moment, Thomas had believed his decision to be right, convinced he was acting in the best interest of the Whitfield legacy. But now, watching the scene before him, He realized how deeply mistaken he had been. Alex hadn't lost anything. In fact, he had gained the most important thing of all, a real family and true love. Thomas remained in his car, watching as Mark and Emily entered the house. His thoughts churned in his mind. He had lost everything that truly mattered. He had rejected his son not because Emily was unworthy, but because his own prejudices and arrogance had blinded him to real values. Thomas realized he had made an irreparable mistake, and with that realization, the world around him became even colder and emptier. After witnessing the scene in front of his son's house, where Emily embraced her father, Mark Blake, Thomas Whitfield realized the magnitude of his mistake. This error had shattered everything he once believed was the foundation of his life and the future of his family. Pride and arrogance had blinded him, and now Thomas stood before a terrifying truth. He had lost not only his son, but also a chance at a great future for their family. Thomas remained in his car for a long time after Mark and Emily disappeared inside. His mind struggled to process the emotions flooding him, a mix of bitterness, shame, and regret. He now understood that his son would never return to him voluntarily. Thomas had chosen pride and power over love, rejecting Alex for his choice of partner. But now, knowing that Emily was the daughter of one of the most influential men in the country, Thomas realized that everything he had once believed to be right was wrong. Emily, whom he had deemed unworthy, had turned out to be far beyond his narrow conceptions. Never before had Thomas felt so lost. He was used to controlling everything, his business, his employees, even his family. But this time, control had slipped from his grasp. He hadn't lost Alex because his son couldn't survive without money, but because Thomas himself had failed to see the true values that motivated his son. In the days following this revelation, Thomas was in despair. He tried to contact Alex, calling him, sending messages, even reaching out through business acquaintances, but there was no response. Alex ignored every attempt. His son was deeply hurt, and Thomas knew that simple apologies or promises would no longer restore the trust. Thomas realized that unless he took decisive action, his relationship with Alex would never be repaired. So he did something he had never done before. He reached out directly to Mark Blake. There was no other option but to ask for help from the man he once saw merely as a powerful business competitor. Thomas understood that if anyone could help him reconcile with his son, it would be Emily's father, a man whose values clearly differed from his own. At first, Thomas wasn't sure how to approach the matter. Mark Blake wasn't someone you could simply ask for a personal favor. They weren't close, despite the overlap between their businesses in various sectors. Thomas hesitated for a long time, but eventually he gathered the courage to request a meeting through mutual contacts. When the meeting was arranged, Thomas was filled with anxiety. He didn't know how Blake would perceive him. They met at a quiet restaurant, far from the bustling business district. Thomas was nervous, but when Mark walked into the room, his confidence wavered even more. Blake, despite his immense influence, appeared calm, confident, and as if he had nothing to prove. Thomas understood that he wasn't just sitting across from a businessman, but a father whose values were entirely different from his own. Mark began the conversation calmly, without any excess emotion, which only heightened Thomas's unease. Blake knew that Thomas wanted to talk about Alex and Emily, and got straight to the point. He shared his own story, about how he had always wanted his children, including Emily, to live simple lives, away from the privileges and pressures of enormous wealth. He had purposely stayed in the background to give them the chance to grow and make their own decisions. According to Mark, he believed that money and status should never define a person, which is why he had allowed Emily to choose her own path. Thomas was stunned. Unlike him, Mark had deliberately avoided influencing his children through wealth. For Mark, it was important that they learn to appreciate the simple joys of life and build their lives on personal achievements, not family capital. This was a lesson Thomas had never learned. At that moment, he realized that he had spent his life controlling his family through power, force, and expectations. He had never considered that love and trust could be more important tools in his relationship with his son. The conversation with Mark was a turning point for Thomas. He saw how deeply flawed his approach to life and parenting had been. Thomas, who had always judged people by their status and position, realized for the first time that these values had led to the destruction of his relationship with the most important person in his life, his son. This lesson was bitter, but necessary. Several months passed before Thomas gathered the courage to take the next step. He knew that repairing his relationship with Alex would take time, and that simple apologies wouldn't be enough. But he could no longer live with the feeling that he had lost his son forever. So, despite his fear of rejection, Thomas made the first move. He wrote his son a letter. It wasn't just an apology. It was a heartfelt cry in which Thomas acknowledged all his mistakes. He apologized for his arrogance, for putting his pride above his love for his son, and asked Alex to give him a chance to make things right. Alex didn't respond for a long time, and Thomas began to lose hope. But one day, he received a short message from his son. "We can meet." It was more than Thomas could have expected. He was overjoyed that Alex was at least willing to hear him out. The meeting took place within the family circle. Thomas invited Alex and Emily to dinner. At first, Alex was wary and cold. He had long been unsure whether to give his father another chance, as the bitterness from that day when Thomas threw him out still lingered in his heart. But Emily convinced him that perhaps his father had changed and deserved one last chance to mend their relationship. Emily had always seen more in people than just their mistakes and believed that everyone was capable of change. At the dinner, Thomas was more open than he had ever been. He didn't try to justify himself or find excuses for his past actions. Instead, he admitted that he had been wrong and that his arrogance had cost him his relationship with the most important person in his life. Thomas shared his feelings, explaining how he had come to understand that true wealth wasn't in money or power, but in the love and trust of those closest to you. He asked Alex for another chance to rebuild their relationship and promised never to put his ambitions above his family again. Alex listened cautiously. He still doubted whether his father had truly changed, but something in Thomas's voice made him reconsider. Alex realized that his father had genuinely learned from his mistakes. He decided to give Thomas one last chance, but warned that it wouldn't be easy and that it would take time for their relationship to heal. The story ended with Thomas not only regaining his son, but also finding a new family. He had learned to value the true human qualities that go far beyond money and power. Thomas understood that true wealth wasn't a bank account balance, but the people around us and the relationships we build based on love, trust, and respect.